we can start the class. Valerie, how are you doing?
I'm good. Sorry, I had to miss the class. My plane was late.
Yes, I got your email. I mean, things happen. I guess the advantage of an online class is that you can always hear the recording.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. Okay, I hope Tom is okay. His connection is working. And Michael is not here today yet, so.
Yeah, Tom, no. We cannot see you, Tom.
Okay, so how is the reading going? Any questions? We kind of discussed, we did discuss the mean in our last class. And I think we left off at the point where Aristotle makes the distinction between emotions, characteristics, dispositions, and he says that virtue is a disposition. It's a disposition that can be acquired through habituation. Right, and we spent a bit of time talking about habituation, that how his whole entire project of ethical education is based on action and habituation. And he is now getting into the nitty-gritty here about virtue as a disposition and how to navigate extremes, right? And he kind of lays out kind of a formulaic explanation about acquiring a mean. That's something that falls between the two extremes. It's neither good nor bad. It's neither excessive nor deficient, right? So somewhere in the middle. And so the question really is that, how do you know that your action is on the mean? You know, it's a middle ground. I think that is a very tough task that he recognizes, that is kind of tough to recognize what that mean is. So we'll get into some of that discussion today when we go to the next chapter and sort of chapter 8 and 9, where he ends book 2. But just curious if you guys have any questions or queries or any comments. Yes, Craig.
I was thinking about the practical wisdom in determining that mean, what's appropriate. And it seems like the analogy with art.
Yes.
It's almost a subject of aesthetics. That, and he talks about perception being what's needed to determine the mean, and one has to have a sense of what's right, what feels right, and that's going to vary from person to person. It's complicated.
It's quite complicated. That's exactly right. Yeah.
It's a judgment.
It's a judgment. Yes, and it's very hard to develop a good sense of judgment. And also, perceptions, like everybody's perception, it varies, right? So even like when it comes to aesthetics and you discuss a painting, people have very different
oh, absolutely.
views, right? It's so subjective. And so actually you're right. My question to Aristotle would be that, objectively speaking, is it even possible to attain a mean? You know, or is it just a subjective proposition? Right?
And isn't that the problem of life? Dealing with uncertainty. This is what the whole book's about, trying to structure uncertainty and our normal fight of wanting things to be certain, and they're not. That's right.
That's right. We look for certainties, and when there aren't any, then what do you do? Right?
And keep living.
Well, I think that's where, as Craig is pointing out, I think the role of, or the function of judgment becomes critical. right? How do you orient yourself in the world or in times of crises? You know, like, yeah, just imagine that you are, you're being thrown into the midst of the coronavirus. You're
Right.
traveling and you suddenly realize that there is one passenger who is infected.
Right.
How are you going to react?
Right.
Are you just going to panic and say, no, throw this person out of the flight? You know, are you going to be that person, or would you do something else?
Take a lot of alcohol, wipe disorder.
Uh-huh. Yeah, see, so that's where I think that's the Aristotelian project, that how do you train subjects, citizens, through ethical education, that they are well-oriented and they're anchored in the world, you know? I think there are interesting examples, especially when, you know, as we started the book, we talked about Socrates and how Socrates kind of overshadows the question of moral virtues, and it is still there, and we'll get to those points. And, you know, there is an invocation of the Iliad, there's an invocation of the Odyssey. Those are examples that Aristotle, of course, had internalized, and he's processing those. And he's of course learned lessons from those epics and Socratic philosophy, and he's pushing the envelope. You know, he's not entirely satisfied with the Socratic propositions, and yet he seems to give in. You know, so that's sort of also in the background of this text that we should be sensitive to. But yes, I think, Craig, the issue of practical wisdom is central, not only to Aristotle, but also to Socrates. But for Socrates, I think it's a little bit more restrictive, because he thinks that philosophy, which is a form of wisdom, is the only form of excellence that is available to humans. And Aristotle is saying, no, there is another form, and that is moral virtue.
Right.
Right? And so he is saying, for Socrates, it's just intellectual virtue, where practical wisdom is possible and where human beings can be virtuous. But Aristotle is saying, no, there's another realm, and that's the realm of ethical virtues, because it's more capacious. That's where our emotions and the desiring part of the soul becomes important, right? Because Socrates has no way of accounting for that. Or, you know, he kind of dismisses that. You know, desires and emotions, they are all kind of clubbed together in intellectual virtue.
For some reason, I thought that the explanation that the virtues were acquired through dispensation from the gods,
yes,
was the type of moral virtue. For some reason, I associate those with the moral virtues.
Ah, I see.
That judgment comes from the gods.
Well, that may be. It's just that for Socrates, there's one virtue, and virtue is knowledge, right? He's not making the distinction that there are emotions and desires and passions and rationality. You know, he's not making those distinctions so clearly as Aristotle is. And so, you know, that's why it's just one form, right?
That's a really helpful distinction between the first part of this program and the second part now. That's a really helpful comment for me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, yes. So that's why I think Aristotle opens the door to something much more complex. You know, I think that's where it becomes really important, because he thinks that emotions and affects are a very important part of any human's life. So how do you account for those? And how do you account for actions that are informed by affects and emotions like anger, desire, you know, how do you account for those? And how do you actually educate those emotions or train those emotions? And he thinks it's possible through habituation, through ethical education. Yes, does that make sense?
Yeah, I've been curious about the relationship between word virtue and virtues because I recognize that they weren't the same thing.
Yes.
I couldn't resolve that. And
Right.
in my professional side, I deal a lot with emotions in business. And this all really fits together. I don't mean to be solicitous, but it really helps me fit all that together.
Right, right. I think, well, that's where I think Aristotle is interesting, because Socrates, if you recall, Meno, in the Meno, he kind of steers the discussion away from several kinds of virtues to one form of virtue. And he says virtue is knowledge, right? Anything that is about knowledge is virtue. How to know, right? That is a virtue, right? Or virtue. For Aristotle, I think at the outset he recognizes, no, actually there are multiple forms of excellences because there are multiple kinds of activities and actions that human beings perform, right? And so some of these are instrumental in getting to the final act, he says, or the final goal, right? And some actually don't. They just kind of wither away, right? They perform their function and that's that. That's the end of those, right? So for Aristotle too, then, it's through the multiplicity of ends that you come to a final end. But sometimes those multiple ends kind of fall off your path. And that is okay. They'll be taken place by something else, right? So he recognizes that there are different kinds of virtues, and broadly speaking, there are two: intellectual and ethical. Right? And he thinks that ethical virtue is more capacious, right? Because, and it can be complicated because of the intricacies and conflicting emotions and desires that we experience, right? And he thinks that they have to be accounted for because he thinks that they are also susceptible. They can be susceptible to reason. They do obey reason. It's possible. You know, they're not entirely irrational. Right? So that's the important distinction, I think, between the Socratic project and the Aristotelian.
Is emotion the only variable in that equation?
It is a big variable, yes. Yes, it is.
But does anybody work with any other variables further on in the learning?
Such as?
I don't know. It seems simplistic to say the only variable is emotion.
Well, emotions are pretty deep and complicated, right? Passions, desires, emotions. I mean, one has to wonder why there is such a discussion of Agamemnon's anger, right? People have written books on that because it's such a deep, complicated emotion. So, I mean, I cannot think of any other variable, really. It makes sense to think about reason, passion, and desires as a complex of emotions, you know, which constitute anyone's self, right? Or to speak in the language of the ancient philosophers, the soul, the structure of the soul, right, is based on reason and non-reason. And non-reason is then divided into emotions and passions and desires, which can be subdivided into anger and, you know, courage love, hate.
And situation.
Sure, exactly. Circumstances. Yes,
Yeah.
Aristotle is big on that too,
Yeah.
especially in book 3. Okay, so anything else, or shall we dive into the text?
Let's go to the text.
Okay, let's go to the text. So we finished off in chapter 5, and that's where we determined, especially in the first sentence when he talks about the next point to consider is the definition of virtue or excellence, as there are 3 kinds of things found in the soul. And that's important, I think: emotions, capacities, and characteristics. And so he goes on to then define where virtue falls. And so at the end of the chapter, he's pretty clear on demarcating or defining virtue as a form of characteristic or disposition. But he also thinks that, you know, we are seeking the perfection of the part of the soul that experiences feelings. And they are really important. And experiencing feelings entails having capacities, right? And that's really important, having capacities for a range of emotions. So virtue then comes down to characteristics or dispositions, which, by the way, if you recall, are constituted or formulated in early childhood when we experience pleasure and pain, right? Praise and blame, right? And those are critical experiences in the childhood, anyone's childhood. And that's where he agrees with Plato in saying that early childhood education is important because that's where the function of habituation is critical, right? Children are taught to mold their pleasure, what is pleasurable to them, into what is not, right? To be able to learn how to self-control. Okay, so let's move on then to chapter 6. Also, in chapter 5, what he's making clear is that virtue and vice together are the disposition of the soul. So, as I said earlier, that soul is a primary mover in these texts or in this philosophy, right? The self is defined by the soul, right? And it's just the soul that has these dispositions, okay? Dispositions of virtue, dispositions of vice. Okay, and so, but for Aristotle, of course, the objective is that how these dispositions are actually moving toward an ergon, right? Work or product, right? An ergon that is done well, right? So in chapter 6, he gives, in the first paragraph, he actually gives us an example of the eye. So remember that Aristotle is constantly giving us references of the body, the health of the body, which is his reference point to understand the soul, right? That the body is healthy by avoiding excesses and deficiencies. And so the soul can also be healthy by avoiding excessive pleasures, excessive pains, or deficiencies in pleasure and pain. Okay, so Valerie, would you get us started? And would you please read in chapter 6?
Chapter 6 from the very beginning?
Yes, please.
Okay. It is not sufficient, however, merely to define virtue in general terms as a characteristic. We must also specify what kind of characteristic it is. It must then be remarked that every virtue or excellence, first, renders good the thing itself of which it is the excellence, and second, causes it to perform its function well. For example, the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its function good. For good sight is due to the excellence of the eye. Likewise, the excellence of a horse makes it both good as a horse and good at running, at carrying its rider, and at facing the enemy. Now, if this is true of all things, the virtue or excellence of man too will be a characteristic which makes him a good man and which causes him to perform his own function well. To some extent, we have already stated how this will be true. The rest will become clear if we study what the nature of virtue is. Of every continuous entity that is divisible into parts, it is possible to take the larger, the smaller, or an equal part, and these parts may be larger, smaller, or equal either in relation to the entity itself or in relation to us. The equal part is something median between excess and deficiency. By the median of an entity, I understand a point equidistant from both extremes, and this point is one and the same for everybody. By the median relative to us, I understand an amount neither too large nor too small, and this is neither one nor the same for everybody. To take an example, if 10 is many and 2 is few, 6 is taken as the median in relation to the entity, for it exceeds and is exceeded by the same amount, and is thus the median in terms of arithmetical proportion. But the median relative to us cannot be determined in this manner. If 10 pounds of food is much for a man to eat, and 2 pounds little, it doesn't follow that the trainer will prescribe 6 pounds, for this may in turn be much or little for him to eat. It may be little for Milo and much for someone who has just begun to take up athletics. The same applies to running and wrestling. Thus we see that an expert in any field avoids excess and deficiency, but seeks the median and chooses it, not the median of the object, but the median relative to us.
Okay. Okay, shall we pause here and see what's going on? All right, so what is he doing with the excellence of the eye and the excellence of the horse in talking about the excellence of humans?
We're saying that the excellence of the eye accomplishes two things. It makes the eye good, and it also enables the eye to perform its
Function.
purpose.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And the same thing for a horse. The excellence of the horse makes the horse good, and also enables it to accomplish its purpose. And he draws analogy with those two to discuss man,
Mm-hmm.
that virtue makes a man good, but also allows the man to perform and live in a way which is good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it seems, I mean, what do you think of these analogies? Like, what if the eye goes bad? You know, you age, you have cataract, you're unable to see. And in those days, who knows what kind of surgeries were performed. You know, and so then what? The eye is unable to perform well. And, you know, the horse, what if the horse is diseased, is sick, is unable? Then what would Aristotle say about those things?
Well,
And so
he argues that virtue is enduring, and that once one becomes habituated to being virtuous, that that's a permanent characteristic.
Yes.
And that's what he counts on, because when he says it's not enough just to perform virtuous acts, one has to perform them as a virtuous person would. And one of the qualifications is that it has to be from a enduring and constant character.
That's right. So that's why there's so much emphasis in the previous chapters on repeated actions,
right? Practice,
habituation. That
so he's counting on the fact that once one becomes virtuous, they will remain virtuous. Now, that may not necessarily hold.
Yes.
It certainly doesn't hold for your example of the eye or.
Right. Exactly. It seems like it has there's a duration involved, especially in the analogies that he gives. Maybe in humans, it works slightly differently. And it works slightly differently precisely by what you were saying, Craig, that, you know, because humans become virtuous through repeated actions, repeated practice. You know, it begins in early childhood, right? And so that's how you've internalized it. You know, it has become part of you. It's through habituation that it stays with you, right? So that is the enduring part of human virtuosity.
Right. And it's interesting that he discusses the fact that because sight comes naturally, there's no need to perform seeing in order to obtain sight. So there's no habituation.
Exactly.
And that in habituation, this constant seeing is not going to improve your sight.
Right.
Exactly. Might make it worse.
Yes. Yeah. And so in that sense, because when I was reading this and I thought these analogies don't really make the case for virtue or human ergon. You know, like they're questionable, you know, and I was just curious if, you know, you had similar thoughts or you had something else or, you know, to say, because yes, the eye and the horse, well, the horse is trained, you know, so the horse has some kind of habituation perhaps.
Yeah, the horse analogy is better probably.
It's better than just the biological organ. You know, I mean, if he was making the argument for training the eye to see art, then that might be different.
Yes.
You know, then you're training the eye to learn something, to do something, not just seeing, but seeing in a particular or informed way. Okay, so very good. Okay, so then what is this median that he goes on about? I mean, is it a mathematical mean or it's not?
I think it's another one of his sort of texts where he tries to explain that there is no exact science in ethics. You know, I think it's the third or fourth time when he sort of is saying that you have to be cautious and there is no precise sort of meaning in anything, right? It's very subjective. So, you know, in arithmetics, you can just add two things and divide it by 2, and then you will find the median. But in real life, you know, to find something between excess and deficiency will be different for everybody.
Yes, that's right. So that's exactly right. So he's kind of moving toward a concept of relativity, it seems. What is he doing with the example of this trainer, Milo?
The big wrestler needs to eat a lot, and someone who's not that big needs to eat less.
That's right. Yeah. So the wrestler has different needs, and it might seem excessive to us for a normal diet, but it works for him. So again, that's right. So the mean is not a mathematical mean. It's not purely scientific, but it changes, right? It changes from person to person, right? So like, I guess that's how we talk about also people having a threshold of pain. Some people have a very low threshold and some people have a very high threshold, you know? So he's actually with that, I think, he's introducing the complexity of becoming virtuous. Like it seems like it's a very difficult and complicated task, you know, and you cannot have one measure of it that applies to everybody, right? So if you're living in a city state and you want to have some kind of a measure of ethics and virtue and vice, how do you do that? Right? It's this tension that he's addressing in his work here. Okay, any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
I have to be blunt. I can't find where we are.
Page 42.
Page 42.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that helps me greatly. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay. So, but because Aristotle is a scientist, I think he is striving for some measure because he thinks that every science performs its function well by looking to the mean and leading its work to that, right? And so he would like some kind of affirmation or confirmation of having that mean when it comes to being virtuous, so that one can actively seek that end, right? Or strive to achieving that end. And so work well and be a good human being and lead a good life. So there is a little bit of that in this, you know, and we don't know how successful he is going to be, but at least he is motivated by this scientific insight.
Also analogous to geometry,
Mm-hmm.
and Euclid had such success with geometry that I think all the other philosophers were trying to draw analogies with geometry to achieve that similar success.
Mm-hmm.
So the mean has a kind of a geometric interpretation.
Absolutely. That's right. Yes. But it is hard to contain human actions and emotions in arithmetical formulas or, you know, or geometric equations, because we're not robots. You know. Okay, so let's see. Let's carry on and read in the next paragraph. And who would like to go next?
I can go next, but I have to position myself more precisely. I'm on an Oxford edition of.
Okay, what Craig can read, and then Max, maybe we can take you next.
If this then is the way in which every science perfects its work, by looking to the median and by bringing its work up to that point, and this is the reason why it is usually said of a successful piece of work that it is impossible to detract from it or to add to it, the implication being that excess and deficiency destroy success, while the mean safeguards it. Good craftsmen, we say, look toward this standard in the performance of their work. And if virtue, like nature, is more precise and better than any art, we must conclude that virtue aims at the median. I am referring to moral virtue, for it is moral virtue that is concerned with emotions and actions, and it is in emotions and actions that excess, deficiency, and the median are found. Thus we can experience fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, and generally any kind of pleasure and pain, either too much or too little, and in either case, not properly. but to experience all this at the right time, toward the right objects, toward the right people, for the right reason, and in the right manner, that is the median and the best course, the course that is a mark of virtue. Shall I continue?
Sure, yeah, let's read the other paragraph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similarly, excess, deficiency, and the median can also be found in actions. Now, virtue is concerned with emotions and actions. And in emotions and actions, excess and deficiency miss the mark, whereas the median is praised and constitutes success. But both praise and success are signs of virtue or excellence. Consequently, virtue is a mean in the sense that it aims at the median. This is corroborated by the fact that there are many ways of going wrong, but only one way which is right. For evil belongs to the indeterminate, as the Pythagoreans imagined, but good to the determinate. This, by the way, is also the reason why the one is easy and the other hard. It is easy to miss the target, but hard to hit it. Here, then, is an additional proof that excess and deficiency characterize vice, while the mean characterizes virtue. For bad men have many ways, good men but one.
Very good. Okay, what is going on here? Craig mentioned earlier the analogy that he gives of art to understand virtue, which I think is quite interesting. Just curious if other people have thoughts on it.
I was disturbed by I read these sentences as being black and white rather than gray. And that seemed to be out of the pace of what I was experiencing in all the reading of understanding the gray. And this is I interpreted these last 2 or 3 sentences as being very black and white.
Why?
It'd be a seminal issue in the whole book. If I'm understanding all the gray and I'm seeking a path through gray, he's saying there's just one way. And it seemed inconsistent with the philosophy I was picking up from the reading.
Yeah, he's kind of implying that there is only one point.
Right.
That's correct, which disagrees with his comments about precision, not demanding more precision than the subject allows.
But isn't it, one point for a particular person? Because, just before that, he said that there are different ways for different people, right? If you are very big, then you will be eating more. But, for you as a person, there is one optimum size of a meal, and it's just one, right? If you eat more, then you will overeat. If you eat less, then you will undereat. But it doesn't exclude the fact that, there are different meal portions for different people.
Right.
So the grayness is there, it's just between the people.
Right. But there's another, I think he's also putting his finger on the difficulty of the task.
Okay.
The difficulty of acquiring the mean is super difficult, actually. Like when he gives the example of art, I mean, we all agree that good art is terribly hard to make, right? And so he is already kind of, when he talks about, the mode for the measure of the mean is if it is furnished by the work of art, which is a mark of perfection, right? If you take out anything from it, or if you add anything to it, it will destroy it. It will destroy the work of art, right? And if that is the measure of acquiring a mean in your virtuous activity, I think he's saying it is terribly difficult. It's not as easy. to, you know, it's not as easy to get to that. And so the question is that how can one attain it? Or what makes it so difficult to get to the mean? Is it because we get strayed by the non-rational part of our soul? You know, it's because there's something went wrong in the habituation process. You know, is it because our logos is not very strong? You know, like, so there are all these factors that seem to complicate getting to the mean. Like, it sounds very easy, you know, if you think about it in mathematical terms, because you solve the problem, you solve the proof, you have the mean, like, oh, that was easy. But when it is translated to the practice of human soul,
It's virtually impossible, right?
it's virtually impossible. And I think that's what he is trying to get us to see, that it's a terribly difficult task, but it is. And so later on, I'll point out when he says that it is a task, you know, and as human beings, we are tasked to get to the mean in our own individual journeys.
Is it all right to have different strokes for different folks here?
I think so.
That's what's the conflict for me in this paragraph. Is he saying there is a universal good, a correct versus what is it correct for in society, or can it be correct for the individual?
Yes, it is. But okay, I want us to see in line 30 on page 43, when he talks about, you know, evil belongs to the indeterminate before that and good to the determinate. And he says, this, by the way, is also the reason why the one is easy and the other hard. It is easy to miss the target, but hard to hit it. What do you make of that? I think that's very crucial here when he's talking about the mean. It's not so
That's
simple.
my perplexity here, because I don't know whether the target is for the individual or society.
I think both determine it.
For the individual.
It is through the individual, but the individual also is part of society.
Okay.
You know?
All right.
And education is done through society, right?
But then is he saying that there is no shared good, Tom? This is what you are asking? So there is no shared understanding of what is good?
Well, I think I don't know what he's saying. I'm trying to understand what he's trying. It seems to me that, you know, it seems inconsistent with the whole book that there is a black and white good. If the book has any meaning, it's understanding your own path. And you know, he's not going to influence me, but if I'm trying to learn and expand my consciousness, am I to search a specific goal? And that's how people think. It's authoritarian versus non-authoritarianism. My question was kind of simple. Is he saying here, you have a right to set your own authorities, or do you have to follow some other dictate? And I think that's a struggle we go through every hour.
You have to do what's appropriate for yourself.
Yeah, yes. Right. That's what I feel.
That's right. That's right. It's you. You are the agent.
Right.
Right. You
and
are
you
the
have to
agent.
have an educated agent. You have to have an educated self. You
That's
have to strive for understanding it. But the end is not.
So it is you. It's the individual act that is important.
Right.
But that act is also informed by education that takes place in society, that takes place
thinking,
at home.
by dialogue.
Exactly. By friends, by family, schools, teachers,
culture.
Your own children, you know, so in that sense, you know, you come into your own socially. And he established that very early on in the book by saying that man is a social and political animal.
Okay.
Right? But it is you. It is you make choices, right? We'll get to in book 3 about choices. It's you who make choices. You're making decisions. You are laying out your path.
Right.
Elizabeth, what are you thinking? Just curious.
Pardon?
We cannot hear you, sorry.
No, we cannot.
We can't hear you. Oops. Oh, okay.
You're on mute. But you're on mute in the system, so you have to unmute yourself. Now you're on mute. No, now you've unmuted yourself, but we cannot still hear you.
Okay, yeah, I don't know, we cannot, but you can hear us? Okay, okay, great. Okay, so the difficulty of achieving the mean, I think, is important because he is saying it is hard to hit the target. And the target is to get to the mean, okay? All right, so let's carry on and see where he takes us with this point. So Max, do you want to read from your translation? Sometimes it's good to hear other translations.
The question is, where do I start?
So we finished in line 35.
Okay.
In section 1106B.
So I start with 1107A.
7A. Uh-huh.
Okay. So I will pick up a little bit from 35, right?
Okay, yes.
Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice,
Uh-huh.
line in mean, i.e. the mean relative to us, this being determined by reason and by that reason by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is indeterminate. Hence, in the respect of what it is, the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. But not every action, not every passion admits of a mean. Some have names that already imply badness. For example, spite and shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions, adultery, theft, murder. For all of these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excess of deficiencies in them. It is not possible then even to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman at the right time and in the right way, but simply to do any of them is it to go wrong. It would be equally absurd then to expect that in an unjust, cowardly, and self-indulgent action, there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. For at that rate, there would be a mean of excess and of deficiency, an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. But as there is no excess and deficiency in temperance and courage, because what is intermediate is in essence an extreme, so two of the actions we have mentioned, there is no mean nor excess and deficiency, but however they are done, they are wrong. For in general, there is a mean of excess and deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean.
Wow.
Confused after that.
So he's established, first of all, he's established that mean is relative, right? It's relative to us. Then he said, well, it is hard to hit this target, the mean, right? And now he's saying, he starts by talking about choice, right? That we make a choice in deciding, in taking action. And I think it's important, and Craig, that's what you, I think, brought up early in the class today, that, you know, a mean which is defined by a rational principle such as a man of practical wisdom. So he's also saying here now that even emotions or feelings, they have the capacity to obey reason, right? So practical wisdom, reason, it does play a role. So I want to remind ourselves here of first his rejection, like his seeming rejection of the Socratic principle or the Socratic idea of intellectual virtue or virtue as a form of knowledge informed by reason, right? He seemed to stray away from that. And now, towards the end of this book, especially as we read on, he's actually conceding to the Socratic principle. And the importance or significance of practical reason, importance of rationality is coming back into play. So just putting it out there, right? That he did not completely reject this notion. It is important. Although maybe in a different way, in a very Aristotelian way. Okay, but this is something for us to look out for. Okay, so then he is now talking about, basically he's talking about these two poles, excess and deficiency, right? And within this spectrum of excess and deficiency, he's trying to establish what is good and what is bad. And so he's giving us these examples, you know, adultery, murder, etc., etc. You know, if you commit adultery with the right woman at the right time, does it make it all right?
Depends.
And, you know, I don't know, what if people are in open marriage? You know, what would it mean to them? People have experimented with this idea, haven't they?
Mm. But that wouldn't be adultery, right?
Then it won't be adultery.
Yeah. Open
In their
marriage,
eyes,
open
maybe.
marriage.
I mean, it is complicated here, you know,
But that's the lesson, isn't it?
that is the lesson. Yes, right, yes. But the general point the generalization he's making here is that the mean is neither excessive nor deficient, right? It's somewhere in the middle. It doesn't harm, you know, it doesn't harm you, and it doesn't kind of just praise you, but it's somewhere in the middle. It's a balancing act. Well, he does say, but in regard to goodness and excellence, it is an extreme.
Because it's the best.
It's the
If you can hit
best.
the mean,
Yes.
then you've acted in the best possible way. So it's an extreme in that sense.
Right. But it's a target that is hard to hit. Right? It's an extreme that is hard to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? What are your thoughts?
I think that it's very accurate. In everything we do, whether we think it explicitly or implicitly, or consciously or unconsciously, we're always trying to hit that mean in the way we live.
Mm-hmm. Agree or disagree? Others?
Agree.
Agree?
Agree.
Yes, that's part of the ethical or moral education, right?
But
Yes?
there's another dimension to that. and that's where the personality enters into it, and the tolerance for ambiguity. So the mean, and in social psych, there are certain tests you can take of your tolerance for ambiguity and the tolerance for specificness. And it turns out to be a really definition of individuals, because the mean, we're trapped into thinking that the mean is an arithmetic issue. And it's not. It's a very broad thing. And some people, our tolerance for broadness of that view, okay? The mean doesn't mean the center of the meter, even if you're setting it. The mean can be very, very broad. Back to the tolerance of your acceptance of vagueness. That's a variation in our personalities. And it even changes in subjects each individual has. So, you know,
Right.
you end up wondering, you expect him to be going somewhere, and maybe what he's going is a very foggy area rather than a specific.
Right. So I think where we're heading with this is that what he wants us to see, Aristotle, that is, that the mean really becomes perspectival, right? It is relative. He's already said it's relative to us, but that also is very perspectival. So it changes from one perspective to another, right? And so therefore, it seems the target keeps moving. You know, the target of getting to the mean keeps moving, and that's why it is so hard to hit it. Right?
And I'm just trying to add that some people don't need to hit a specific target.
Yeah, that may be, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's see some of the examples he gives about the mean in particular virtues, because some of those will become important in the book. So, Isabel, would you like to get us started? At least the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, they're short paragraphs. So if you could read till line 7 or 8, that will get us to the meat of this.
Chapter 7.
Yes.
However, this general statement is also show that in its particular instances, when in discussion of moral actions, although general statements have a wider range of application,
I think we lost Isabel. Isabel, we lost you.
okay.
We can hear, I can hear her.
Okay.
Max, you can't?
No.
Must harmonize with them. Let us now take particular virtues and vices from the following table. In feeling of fear and confidence, courage is the main. As for the excess, there is no name that describes a man who exceeds in fearlessness. Many virtues and vices have no name. But a man who exceeds in confidence is reckless, and a man who exceeds in fear and is deficient in confidence is cowardly. In regard to pleasures and pains, not all of them, and to a lesser degree in the case of pains, the main is self-control and the excess of self-indulgence. Men deficient in regard to pleasure are not often found, and there is therefore no name for them, but let us call them insensitive.
Okay, so how is he applying his idea of mean to these particular examples? Do you experience such things as well? Just curious. How does he talk about courage? as a mean?
He characterizes it as the emotions of fear and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And how does our character stand with respect to those two extremes?
Mm-hmm.
How does one
Mm-hmm.
deal with fear, and does one have a sufficient confidence?
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
I mean,
So,
the table, it would have been so much easier to read it if there was a table, and he just put the table. I actually found it in this Udemy on ethics, but it's a bit different in, I mean, it's similar, but it's not exactly the same.
Uh-huh.
Does it have the table?
Yeah.
Oh, it does. I see.
Yeah. And you can, it's online. You can find the whole book online. And
Oh,
there is a table. Yep.
Uh-huh.
What
Valerie,
is
do
it?
you want?
Udemy on ethics?
Yep.
you did.
Udemy and ethics, and it's. I'll send you the link afterwards. I have it downloaded.
And these two works are named after the people that edited them.
Mm-hmm.
Eudemus and Nicomachus, who was his son.
That's right. Yes. Uh-huh.
They were originally lectures.
That's right. There were lectures. Yes. Yes. But going back to what Craig was saying, I think is right that, you know, anyone occupying one extreme pushes the mean off in the other direction, right? So a coward person calls a courageous person rash, you know, and a courageous person would call a coward, but, you know, who's not taking any action or who's being sluggish, right? So that's how the mean works. It's like, so then one wonders, what is the standpoint from which one can recognize the mean, right? And that's why it seems that the whole discussion of the mean is perspectival. It depends on your perspective, where you are on the spectrum, right? And so then again, there is a room for its becoming relative. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so yeah, so
I
what
found line in
yeah,
1108. I found line 4
uh-huh,
interesting because having spent a page and a half talking about gray,
mm-hmm,
he then comes to another aspect of not thinking, but of emotion, anger.
yes.
And he says, there is no, I got to find it again.
In regard to anger, also there exists
Right.
an excess. That?
Yeah.
Yes, there exists an excess, a deficiency, and a mean. Although there really are no names for them, we
Right.
might call the mean gentleness, since we call a man who occupies the middle position gentle. Of the extremes, let the man who exceeds be called short-tempered, and his vice a short temper, and the deficient man apathetic, and his vice apathy. Is that what you were pointing out to, Tom?
Well, yeah, he just moves through different things on these 3 or 4 pages of
Mm-hmm.
saying the world's gray, accept it.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yes. But I think with in this chapter, with the discussion of all these different varieties of emotions and feelings and affects, and there's a very broad range, you know, courage, ambition, anger, So the point really is, you know, so they're put all on this spectrum, and you just move from one extreme to another. But how do you then occupy a position that is compromised? You know, it's a compromised position. It's a middle ground, right?
Right.
And that can vary from one person to another, right? And that's why it's so relative, and that's why it becomes hard to understand, like how to get to that, right? You know, how to generalize it. So the mean is affected by our perception. So we're going to skip a little, and I want us to get to the last chapter, how to attain the mean, because we have talked, I think, at some length about what the mean is and Aristotle's views on it. So let's see what he says about how to attain it. So let's see, I'll read parts of it. Our discussion has sufficiently established, 1, that moral virtue is a mean, and in what sense it is a mean. 2nd, that it is a mean between 2 vices, one of which is marked by excess and the other by deficiency. And 3, that it is a mean in the sense that it aims at the median in the emotions and in actions. That is why it is a hard task to be good. In every case, it is a task to find the median. For instance, not everyone can find the middle of a circle, but only a man who has the proper knowledge. Similarly, anyone can get angry, that is easy, or can give away money or spend it. But to do all this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, and in the right way, is no longer something easy that anyone can do. It is for this reason that good conduct is rare, praiseworthy, and noble. That's really important. And there is, in a way, he said a lot in between the lines. And so let's parse it out. Especially starting from, that is why it is a hard task to be good. That's the whole point of the best way of life. The best way of life in both Socratic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy is to be good, right? To lead a good life. But it is super hard to be good. It's a daunting task to be good. It's not simple. In every case, it is a task to find the medium. For instance, and he gives this example, I don't know what you think of this example, but the point is, in the end, at the end of the sentence, for instance, not everyone can find the middle of a circle, but only a man who has the proper knowledge. We're back to the Socratic principle. So even to have ethical virtue, you really cannot discount the value of intellectual virtue. You have to have the proper knowledge, right? You have to have reason. You have to have practical wisdom to lead a good life, to be good, right? To have a goal in life that culminates in a good. It's a task. So he's saying individuals are tasked to get to this median of virtue, which is a very difficult target to attain. How does that make you feel?
Glad I'm taking this course.
That's right, Tom. I think you are noble.
Thanks to Comcast fixing my circuit.
Yes, right? And
There
then,
seemed to be a disagreement between Socrates and Aristotle, in that Socrates doesn't ultimately believe that virtue can be taught.
mm-hmm.
And Aristotle seems to think that children can be habituated by their parents
Mm-hmm.
to act appropriately.
Mm-hmm. No, that's absolutely right. But what I'm saying is, you know, when book 2 starts, it seems that he is he's challenging Socrates, and he's challenging the Socratic notion that virtue is knowledge. By the end of this book, he has reconciled with that. In addition to his own perspective on ethical virtue, right? And habituation, that is his contribution.
Right.
But then he doesn't really, it's not that he continues to reject the Socratic notion. In fact, he is embracing it, right? And it becomes really, it becomes clearer in the following paragraph. But I also just want to say, like the last sentence of this passage, it is for this reason that good conduct is rare, praiseworthy, and noble, right? And so he's saying something there, that how it's probably not possible for every individual to get to that good conduct. You know, it's very rare, it's difficult. But once you have it, it is praiseworthy and it's noble, right? And so the following paragraph, like now, he's referencing back to Socrates here. The first concern of a man who aims at the median should therefore be to avoid the extreme, which is more opposed to it, as Calypso advises. Keep clear your ship of yonder spray and surf, for one of the two extremes is more in error than the other. And since it is extremely difficult to hit the mean, we must, as the saying has it, sail in the second best way and take the lesser evil. And we can best do that in the manner we have described. There's a lot packed in here. Mm-hmm. There is a reference to the second sailing, and that second sailing is a reference to Socrates on his last day when he's reflecting. Does anybody know what's going on here? Socrates he explains the second sailing on the last day of his life.
But he's saying that in general,
Mm-hmm.
we are inclined to the extreme furthest from the mean.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of courage, we would be inclined toward being cowardly rather than being reckless.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what he's recommending is that you kind of overcompensate.
Mm-hmm.
So to steer as far away from your inclination of being fearful and cowardly. And in doing that, So kind of aim toward reckless. And in doing that, you'll be more likely to land
So,
on being courageous, because you're probably not going to get all the way to reckless. So
right.
you're going to probably fall short of your goal of getting to reckless and wind up as courageous.
Uh-huh.
Same thing with giving money. Your inclination is to not give enough money.
Uh-huh.
And if you attempt to try to give too much, to be prodigal, you'll fall short and wind up being liberal. So.
Well, so Socrates' second sailing was, it's in the Phaedo, I think, and all of his interlocutors are extremely sad, and actually they, to Socrates' dismay, they actually are just articulating or verbalizing their emotions for him, and not paying any attention to the arguments, which Socrates has been very emphatic about all his life. And so the second sailing, the reference is that Socrates actually, on the last day of his life, just before he drinks the hemlock, takes refuge in logos, in reason. And that's what he explains to his interlocutors, that how they should never give up rationality. And that's where everyone can take refuge and correct their actions. So that is Aristotle's way of coming back to the Socratic position. So seemingly at the start of this book, he had rejected that notion. He was just like, well, it's not all about rationality and reason. And here, in a very roundabout way, he comes back to it. And there is an insistence on logos, on argumentation, reasoning, discourse, speech, because logos can mean all of these things, right? So that, and therefore, it's connecting back to the first paragraph. That's what makes it also a hard thing to achieve, right? Because your reason can be colored by all sorts of emotions, extremes, vices, right? And so now he's going to explain further. And these are excellent paragraphs. So then the following paragraph, he gives an example of the Odyssey. And we should talk a little bit about why he's doing that. Moreover, we must watch the errors which have the greatest attraction for us personally. For the natural inclination of one man differs from that of another, and we each come to recognize our own by observing the pleasure and pain produced in us by the different extremes. We must then draw ourselves away in the opposite direction, for by pulling away from error, we shall reach the middle, as men do when they straighten warped timber. In every case, we must be specially on our guard against pleasure and what is pleasant, for when it comes to pleasure, we cannot act as unbiased judges. Our attitude toward pleasure should be the same as that of the Trojan elders was towards Helen. And we should repeat on every occasion the words they addressed to her. For if we dismiss pleasure as they dismissed her, we shall make fewer mistakes. In summary, then, it is by acting in this way that we shall best be able to hit the median. But this is no doubt difficult, especially when particular cases are concerned. For it is not easy to determine in what manner, with what person, on what occasion, and for how long a time one ought to be angry. There are times when we praise those who are deficient in anger and call them gentle, and other times when we praise violently angry persons and call them manly. However, we do not blame a man for slightly deviating from the course of goodness, whether he strays toward excess or toward deficiency. But we do blame him if his deviation is great and cannot pass unnoticed. It is not easy to determine by a formula at what point and for how great a divergence a man deserves blame. But this difficulty is, after all, true of all objects of sense perception. Determinations of this kind depend upon particular circumstances, and the decisions rest with our moral sense. This much, at any rate, is clear, that the median characteristic is in all fields for one that deserves praise, and that it is sometimes necessary to incline toward the excess and sometimes toward the deficiency. For it is in this way that we will most easily hit upon the median, which is the point of excellence. Okay, so sorry, the reference of Odyssey was in the paragraph that we read just now or before that. For one of the two extremes is more in error than the other. And does anybody know what this reference is? What were the two extremes in the Odyssey? When Odysseus has to sail between Scylla and Charybdis, right?
Right.
And he chooses to sail closer to Scylla. That is one extreme, right? And he sees, and he says this was the most horrible experience that he went through on his entire Odyssey or journey, because that's where he lost almost all of his oarsmen, right? And so that's what he's saying, that this is how difficult it is, the task of navigating between extremes.
So by keeping your ship clear of yonder spray, you're aiming more toward Charybdis? Is that?
No. He's saying that sometimes all the options that are available to us are terrible. You know, we're surrounded by these vices and extremes that are not good for us. So, you know, how do you then, the closest you can get to the mean is by choosing the lesser evil. Right? And so Scylla in that instance was the lesser evil.
What was the lesser evil? Okay.
Yeah. Right? But then in the following paragraph, in continuing with the same idea, why does he refer to Helen and the Trojans?
She represented pleasure?
Mm-hmm. And how, right. I mean, she represented the beauty of a goddess, you know.
Right.
She's very...
And so everyone would naturally be inclined to be attracted to her, but that obviously is in excess because of all the problems it created, and it was morally corrupt.
Yes, and so they let go of her.
And so the advice is to avoid that pleasure.
Exactly. Right. That's how the elders of Troy reacted. Right. Yes, exactly. So she represents all of the inclinations toward pleasure. And they, you know, they of course admired her overwhelmingly goddess-like beauty. But then, you know, they bid her farewell. You know, they were like, okay. So really, in some sense, the lesson really is, especially the examples that he gives here, is that how one is, you know, forced to choose lesser evils. You know, sometimes those are the choices. The choices are between extremes. And that might be true for us too, you know. We're surrounded by extremes. And so the option that is left to you is to choose a lesser form of evil, a lesser form of vice. And maybe then it's possible to hit the median or maybe not. So it seems to me that the median is always, I don't know, is kind of a very, it's a moving target, you know, and that's why it is so hard to hit. It's a moving target. It's perspectival. It changes. And it's not formulaic.
Good advice for today.
You know, I mean, that's what I get out of this.
But society has probably a large role in determining what that mean should be in average. Of course, it varies from person to person, but if we didn't have examples set for us by society and other people, we would have even less of an idea of what that mean should be.
Yes, absolutely.
We view ourselves in reference to other people and try to emulate them. So that's in large part how we acquire that knowledge.
No, that's right.
And different societies have different means.
Yes, right. Yeah, so the mean is sort of an intersection of different perspectives, different ideas, you know, and that's why sometimes it's not clear. And it's hard to achieve. I think also, I think there are a couple of lessons to be drawn from this chapter. One is the determination of the mean, which seems very hard. That it seems, you know, it changes, it's relative, it's perspectival, and it's an intersection of what society tells us, what we tell ourselves, what we learn from our tradition, from our parents, through our education. And then secondly, I think, and more importantly, it seems that it is a task that everyone in society is tasked to get to the median, to get to the mean, and that it is super difficult and complicated to achieve it. And that's why it's a lifelong process. You know, it's a lifelong journey. Well, thank you so much for class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, and we will get to interesting bits in book 3 with choice, deliberation, wish, where we'll be spending our time, starting with voluntary and involuntary actions. So, okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.